Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Today, we are going to talk about Jovita Idar, who was a journalist and a teacher and an activist in South Texas in the early 20th century. And researching her life can be a little bit tricky. There are some family papers and newspapers she worked on that are held in various libraries and archives today, but the newspaper collections are incomplete, and a lot of personal documentation was lost in fires at family members' homes in the decades after her death. Also, after Jovita Idar died, her husband remarried, and then after he died in 1958, his widow burned a trunk full of Jovita's personal papers. So sometimes what we know about her comes from family members' recollections from later on, as is often the case when you are talking to somebody about something they remember from decades before. It's not always completely clear which order things happened in or exactly who was involved. Regardless, though, it is very clear that she was a force to be reckoned with. I do have a couple of language notes. One is there is not consistency about whether the name Idar should have an accent mark over the A, including in some Spanish language sources today. Based on the rules of how accent marks work in Spanish, there typically would not be one there, so we have not used one in the text descriptions of the episode. Also, we do recognize that there are a lot of Spanish-speaking people in Texas who have a lot of different ancestries, but Idar and her family were really focused on Mexicans specifically, often, regardless of whether they were born in the United States or Mexico, or which nation they were a citizen of. So when they talked about Mexicans, they were usually talking about both Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants to the U.S., and also Mexicans living in Mexico. And also, last thing, I do want to note up front that there's going to be some discussion of some particularly horrifying racial violence in this episode.
Jovita Idar was born on September 7th, 1885 in Laredo, Texas. So that's about 50 years after Texas ceased to be part of Mexico and 40 years after Texas became a U.S. state. Her parents were Nicasio and Jovita Vivero Idar. Jovita was the second of their 9 surviving children, although a lot of articles say she was the second of 8. It's possible that this discrepancy comes from a misreading of an oral history interview given by her brother Aquiliano, who went by Ike, and his wife Guadalupe in 1984. He lists off 7 siblings and himself who were born in the United States. But then he goes on to say their brother Federico was born in Monterrey, Mexico. Later in the same oral history, he describes their family as including 7 brothers and 2 sisters. So this may just be a math reckoning problem.
Yeah, I think this is sort of my conjecture. I think there may have been an account that read that first sentence and said that was 8 people, and then a lot of other people have picked it up from there.
Right.
Or sort of misunderstood that when he said 7 brothers and 2 sisters, he's counting everyone. I sat there for a while kind of counting the children in a family tree going, this is 9. Why does everyone say 8? And then I read that oral history later on. This whole family was very politically aware and active. So the kind of family that regularly sat down together to discuss all the social and political issues of the day. They were also a middle-class family, so they had more money and more opportunities than a lot of other people of Mexican descent who were living in South Texas. This included more educational opportunities for Jovita and her siblings than a lot of people in their community had access to.
In this part of South Texas, when Jovita was born, less than a quarter of the population was Anglo, or white without Mexican or other Latin American ancestry. Even so, the Mexican population faced ongoing bigotry and racism and racist stereotypes at the hands of the Anglo minority. This was true for the Idars, although their class often gave them some amount of protection. In general, the Anglo community saw families like the Idars as more respectable and a little bit closer to white than other Mexican Americans.
Within their community, the Idars were seen as leaders. This was during the progressive era in the United States, and a lot of the reform movements and organizations of this period were established by people who were a little more affluent and wanted to try to improve the lives and circumstances of people who had less. So this was also true of the Idars. And for the Idar family, this was also connected to a very strong sense of Mexican identity.
Nicasio was a member of a Mexican Masonic lodge, as well as a number of fraternal organizations, including one he established along with some of Jovita's brothers, called La Sociedad Caballeros de Honor, or the Knights of Honor. He served as a justice of the peace and as a U.S. Marshal, and he was a publisher. He published a Masonic review called La Revista, as well as a newspaper called La Cronica. La Cronica's motto, translated into English, was, "We work for the progress and industrial, moral, and intellectual development of all of the Mexican inhabitants of Texas."
The Idars were also devout Methodists, and Jovita went to Methodist schools. This included the Holding Institute, originally known as Laredo Seminary, where she earned a teaching certificate in 1903. Her brother Ike described Jovita as a very patient woman and teaching as her true passion. Even before getting her teaching certificate, if she ran into a child who couldn't read, she'd invite them home for daily lessons in reading and writing with her.
But then she got a job teaching in Los Ojuelos, a very small town to the east of Laredo that at the time had less than 200 residents. In earlier years, this town had been bigger and more prosperous, but it had gone into economic decline after a newly built railroad passed it by. Idar quickly became frustrated with the realities of teaching there. Racial segregation was widespread in much of the U.S. at this point, and while segregated schools for Black children often get the most focus, areas with large Mexican populations followed a similar system, including a lack of funding and resources at the schools for Mexican children. It wasn't just that the school where Idar was teaching was inadequate. She also felt powerless to do anything about it. She cared about what she was doing, and she cared about her students, but she doubted that she could really make a difference in their lives and circumstances.
So she switched careers to one where she thought she could make a difference, and that was journalism. She went to work at La Cronica. The newspaper had at that point grown into a family business, with her brothers, Clemente and Eduardo, also working there. There were other Spanish-language periodicals being published in and around Laredo, but La Cronica became the leading Spanish-language newspaper.
Jovita's brothers and father published articles under their own names, but Jovita used a number of pseudonyms. One was Ave Negra, which read aloud sounded like Ave Negra, meaning blackbird. Another was Estrella, for the Greek goddess of justice. There were also articles in La Cronica that ran without a byline, and some of these were also Jovita's work. Jovita also wasn't the only woman who contributed to the paper. Another was poet and teacher Sara Estela Ramirez, who had been born in Mexico and moved to Laredo in 1898. Ramirez also published newspapers of her own, one in Mexico City and another in Laredo.
La Cronica's reporting included a big focus on civil rights. The systemic bias and racism that were prevalent in areas with a large Mexican population has become known as Juan Crow, as a counterpart to Jim Crow, although that's not a term that was actually in use at the time. Jovita and her brother Clemente both wrote a lot about school segregation and discrimination within the schools. Articles in La Cronica also described how the loss of Spanish language skills in children who were taught only English at school was leading to the erosion of Mexican culture. The paper called for the creation of schools that were taught exclusively in Spanish, with teachers recruited from Mexico.
Jovita also wrote about the need to teach children Mexican history, not just Anglo history. Various sources translate her thoughts on this as, quote, Mexican children in Texas need an education, but if they are taught the biography of Washington, but not Hidalgo, the exploits of Lincoln, but not Juarez, that child will be indifferent to his heritage.
The paper also criticized the treatment of women by the Catholic Church. And Jovita, in particular, wrote a lot about women's access to social and educational opportunities. She had a column called Para la mujer que lee, or For the Woman Who Reads. And she liked to say, quote, educate a woman and you educate her family. She also wrote about the suffrage movement in Texas and the need for women to have the right to vote. Just as a note, women in Texas were given the right to vote in primaries in 1918 and then in other elections when Texas ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919. But non-white people still faced discriminatory laws and practices that often prevented them from being able to exercise their right to vote.
In addition to her work at La Cronica, in 1910, Jovita Idar applied and was approved to be a census taker. In 1911, she also started publishing a 4-page bilingual newspaper with 2 pages in English and 2 in Spanish. This was by and for the school children of Laredo, with students and teachers both writing and editing the paper.
I find that whole project very charming.
Me too.
In 1911, Idar and her family were also involved in a civil rights conference that was held in Laredo, and we will get to that after a sponsor break. One of the subjects that the newspaper La Cronica covered in the early 20th century was the lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in South Texas. Exact numbers are hard to quantify because official records didn't consistently reflect whether a person had Mexican ancestry. Sometimes Mexican Americans were described as Mexican and sometimes as white, and often that was based more on what suited Anglo authorities than how a person framed their own identity. We have talked about this before in our episode on Hernandez versus Texas, which we ran as a Saturday classic in October of 2021. Hernandez versus Texas was a 1954 Supreme Court case in which the court unanimously ruled that Pedro Hernandez, who was known as Pete, had been denied a jury of his peers in his murder trial. That trial was held before an all-white jury with nobody of Mexican ancestry. And while Mexican Americans were officially defined as white, they were being treated as a class apart.
Even with that caveat, though, factoring in their relative population sizes, Mexicans seem to have faced the threat of lynching at a similar rate to Black Americans in other parts of the U.S. In another similarity, the rate of lynching often rose and fell alongside other social, political, and economic issues. For example, we've discussed the Red Summer of 1919, in which white mobs responded to Black soldiers returning from World War I and the Great Migration of Black Americans out of the South with a wave of violence that included riots, massacres, and lynchings. Similarly, lynchings of Mexicans increased during the Mexican Revolution as it stoked Anglo communities' fears around what was happening along the border. White authorities often showed a lack of concern over these extrajudicial murders for both Mexican and Black victims. Sometimes authorities actively covered these killings up or were directly involved.
2 particular lynchings had a profound impact on the Idar family and their community during this period. Antonio Rodriguez, age 20, was accused of killing a white woman in Rock Springs, Texas, northwest of San Antonio in 1910. On November 3rd of that year, an Anglo mob broke into the jail where he was being held, abducted him, tied him to a mesquite tree, and burned him to death. San Antonio newspapers described the town as basically returning to business as usual after Rodriguez was murdered, and no one was arrested or tried for that crime. Since Rodriguez didn't face trial, there was also no further investigation into the original murder.
This was just days before the start of the Mexican Revolution, as tensions were rising in Mexico. We'll have more detail on that later. Rodriguez was a Mexican national, and the lack of response from American authorities led to outrage across Mexico, which fed into the ongoing issues there. There were riots in Mexico City and proposed boycotts of American imports. This became further complicated when rumors surfaced that Rodriguez had been born in the state of New Mexico, not in Mexico. Throughout all of this, a lot of American authorities framed the Mexican response to this injustice as barbaric.
Then on June 19th, 1911, 14-year-old Antonio Gomez was arrested for murder in Thorndale, Texas, which is outside of Austin. Antonio had been whittling a shingle while walking down the street, and bits of wood were dropping onto the ground. The owner of a saloon scolded him for littering, and a man named Charles Zisheng grabbed the shingle out of Antonio's hand and swore at him. This led to a physical fight in which Antonio stabbed Zisheng in the chest. This was a small knife, and Zisheng didn't immediately realize that he had been stabbed, but Antonio had hit a major blood vessel, and Zisheng bled to death.
Constable Robert L. McCoy seemed to recognize that Antonio was in danger of being lynched and planned to take him to another town until he could face trial. But less than 3 hours after Zisheng's murder, a mob intercepted them, dragged Antonio through town by a chain around his neck, beat him, and hanged him. Although a court of inquiry was convened, only 4 men were indicted, although it's certainly likely that more were involved. Charges against one of them were dropped, and the other 3 men were acquitted.
The reporting on this is all over the place, depending on which newspaper you're looking at. So, there are Spanish language newspapers that describe this mob as 100 people, and then there are English language newspapers that say much smaller numbers. It was almost certainly a lot more than 4, though. These were not the only lynchings that were carried out in South Texas during these years, but these too were a big motivating force for Mexican communities and organizers. In response, people in San Antonio created a federation of mutual aid societies called Agrupación Protectora Mexicana to offer basic social services to the community and to try to protect people from lynching and other violence. And through the pages of La Cronica, the Idar family called on Mexican leaders to attend a conference to discuss and organize around these issues.
This conference, called El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, or the First Mexicanist Congress, was held in Laredo from September 14th to 22nd, 1911. It was described as por la raza y para la raza, or for the people and by the people. The term La Raza is still used sometimes today, but with somewhat different connotations depending on where a person is from. But the term Mexicanist isn't really used in this way anymore. At the time, though, both terms were used to describe Mexicans and people with Mexican ancestry as one group, with a similar racial or ethnic identity, often regardless of whether they were born in or living in Mexico or the United States. So this conference was underpinned by a sense of Mexican identity, and it was something of a precursor to the Chicano movement that would evolve decades later.
Yeah, sometimes people also translate La Raza as the race, which has a similar connotation to the people, but slightly different. This conference was one of the first known gatherings in the United States that was held specifically to focus on civil rights for these communities. Attendees included members of various fraternal organizations, including Freemasons and members of churches and community service organizations. This included people from both South Texas and northern Mexico. Topics under discussion included the need for Spanish to be taught and spoken in schools, equal rights for women, and land rights and protections. There was an ongoing pattern of Mexican and Mexican-American landowners losing their land to Anglos through both legal and illegal or deceptive means. As a note, a lot of Mexicans have indigenous ancestry, but of course, this was also following and connected to other indigenous communities similarly losing their land to Europeans. Another big focus at this conference was on labor rights and worker organization, as Mexican workers often faced low pay, poor working conditions, and other exploitation.
And there were also discussions of how to obtain equal civil and legal rights for Mexicans and Mexican Americans. This was something that was already supposed to exist under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, which had ended the Mexican-American War and led to former Mexican territory becoming part of the United States, including Mexico relinquishing all claims on Texas.
Yeah, under that treaty, Mexicans who remained in the U.S. and became U.S. citizens were supposed to have all the same access to the rights and privileges of citizenship as white people were. Jovita Idar was elected president of the women's division of the First Mexicanist Congress, and a new organization, La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, was announced on October 15th, with Jovita Idar also selected as its president. La Liga Femenil Mexicanista was both a political and a charitable organization. They established free schools for Mexican children, as well as doing other community work. Although the creation of this organization was announced on October 15th, Jovita's brother Ike said that it had been her idea from before the first Mexicanist Congress took place. Another organization created through the Congress was La Gran Liga Mexicanista de Beneficia y Protección, which was open to everyone regardless of their citizenship or gender.
While these organizations don't seem to have lasted beyond the 19 teens, they are seen as precursors to the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC. LULAC was founded in 1929 and still exists today, and is recognized as the first organization dedicated to civil rights for Hispanic and Latin Americans in the United States. Jovita's brother Eduardo was one of the founders of LULAC.
Yeah, it's come up in some of our other episodes that have been related to civil rights for Mexican Americans. Some of the most dramatic events in Jovita Idar's life happened a couple of years after this conference, and we will get to that after another sponsor break. The final act of this episode today is going to involve a lot about the Mexican Revolution. So here's an overview of the Mexican Revolution that's just as concise as I could manage. Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico from 1877 to 1880, and then again from 1884 to 1911. And in the interim, the president was somebody that Diaz had personally selected to run. Diaz essentially governed Mexico as a dictator, consolidating his power and undermining the autonomy of local and regional governments. Overall, his policies were seen as benefiting industrialists and wealthy landowners, not the common people who made up the vast majority of the population. That is a very sketchy overview. Over time, Mexico also started to face a number of economic issues, including declining wages and ongoing labor disputes, and there were increasing calls for Diaz to be replaced.
Diaz announced his retirement in 1908. But didn't actually retire, and instead ran for re-election against Francisco Madero. But this was not a fair election. Diaz had Madero imprisoned and declared himself the winner. This led to a revolt, and Diaz was forced to leave office in 1911. But once Madero was in office, Diaz's nephew and others conspired against him, launching a coup d'etat and replacing him with Victoriano Huerta in February of 1913. Madero and his vice president were both arrested and shot. This period became known as the 10 Tragic Days, and initially the war that followed was between the constitutionalists who opposed Huerta and wanted to restore Mexico's constitutional government, and the Mexican Federal Army.
During the Mexican Revolution, there was often fighting directly across the border from the United States. That's something we just talked more about in July in our Saturday Classic on the Battle of Ambos Nogales. This was also the case in Laredo, which is right across the Rio Grande from the Mexican city of Nuevo Laredo. General Jesus Carranza of the Constitutional Army attacked the garrison at Nuevo Laredo on March 17th, 1913.
Leonor Villegas de Magnon was a friend of Jovita Idar, who had been born to a wealthy family in Nuevo Laredo in 1876. She had been educated in the U.S. and had married an American citizen, and they had been living in the U.S. at some points and in Mexico at others. The border between the two nations was almost entirely open, and it wasn't unusual for people to travel or move between them. She was in Laredo during this attack, and after she heard about it, she wasn't able to reach her family or friends back in Nuevo Laredo.
So, as she described in her memoir, which is titled La Rebelde, or The Rebel, she flagged down a car driven by a chauffeur. She had him take her to a pharmacy where the pharmacist gave her a basket of first aid supplies. I got the impression that this pharmacist was somebody that she knew. She drew a red cross on a piece of paper to put in the car's window, and she recruited some of her friends, including Jovita Idar and her sister Elvira. And they all went with her, and then they all in this car headed toward the border.
When they got to the bridge that crossed the Rio Grande, the driver refused to go on, understandably fearful of driving into an active war zone. Leonor in the back seat took a bottle of whiskey from the basket of first aid supplies, held the neck of it to the back of the driver's neck, and told him to drive. He, not knowing that this was just a whiskey bottle and not a gun, drove on. Leonor held a white cloth out the window as they approached the other side of the bridge, and the women were allowed to enter Mexico.
This was the beginning of La Cruz Blanca, or the White Cross. This was a different organization from the similarly named La Cruz Blanca Neutral, which was established by Elena Arizmendi Mejia in 1911 because the Mexican Red Cross was refusing to treat the insurgents. Members of Leonor's organization, La Cruz Blanca, included the Idar sisters and their brother Clemente, who worked as a journalist. He basically documented the work that the organization was doing. They provided aid in Mexico and also smuggled revolutionaries into Texas to be cared for at an improvised hospital that Leonor established in her home. At one point, National Guardsmen tried to shut this hospital down. And at another, army officials came to try to arrest Mexican soldiers who were being treated there. Leonor refused to let them in and then arranged for visitors to bring these men clean civilian clothes so that they could sneak out later without attracting suspicion.
The next moment in Idar's life that has gotten a lot of attention is one that's a little unclear in terms of some of the details and the timeline. Jovita's father, Nicasio, died of some kind of intestinal disorder in 1914. His newspaper, La Cronica, shut down, and Jovita went to work at a newspaper called El Progreso. By that point, the Mexican Revolution had also gone through a shift. Victoriano Huerta had been forced to step down, and he had gone into exile, but the fighting had continued and now was going on among multiple factions.
President Woodrow Wilson dispatched U.S. troops to the border in 1914. In one version of this story, Jovita Idar wrote an editorial that was strongly critical of this. In another version, the editorial had been written by Manuel Garcia Vigil, who was a Mexican national who wrote for the newspaper. Either way, it's possible there were two different editorials. It offended members of the Texas Rangers and the U.S. military. Rangers then came to the offices of El Progreso to demand that the newspaper be shut down. Jovita Idar physically blocked them from entering, telling them that what they were doing was unlawful and was a violation of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In one account, she said, quote, "When a woman stands at the door, you cannot enter." The Texas Rangers left, but they returned the next day when she was not there and destroyed the newspaper's press.
There was another incident at the paper, possibly connected to this story, but possibly not, in 1916. The paper's managing editor, Leo D. Walker, had also written and published material that was critical of the U.S. and its military policy, and of Venustiano Carranza. Carranza had been a leader in the Constitutionalist Army before it had splintered into factions, and he was on the path to becoming Mexico's first president under a new constitution. The Texas Rangers had arrested Walker on a libel charge, and after he was released on bond, a mob of men kidnapped him and forced him to cross the Rio Grande into Mexico at gunpoint. Then they went to the newspaper offices to shut it down. In some versions of the story, this is when Jovita faced down the Texas Rangers. But reporting in English-language newspapers, which did not name anyone specifically, said 2 women had been working at the newspaper offices and that those women left when they were asked to.
There are various reasons for the vagueness that's around this story. One is that there aren't any surviving copies of some of the Spanish-language newspapers that might have contained more detail from the perspective of Laredo's Mexican-American community. There are some, but really not a lot. Coverage in English-language newspapers, on the other hand, is very spotty, And this coverage generally frames the Texas Rangers as the heroes of this whole story and the journalists as unruly miscreants or even traitors.
Another issue is that a major source on this is the oral history testimony given by Ike Idar in 1984. At that point, he was 80, and he was recounting events that had happened when he was 10 or 12 years old. At various points in the interview, including in relating this story, he jumps around in the timeline, or he switches topics, or asks for clarification about things like the names of people that he knew long ago. At the same time, the questions being asked in the interview make it clear that Jovita's facing down the Texas Rangers was already well known in the family and the community, and not something that had first come to light in this interview.
Yeah, this oral history does kind of wander, not in a way that seems alarming to me, just in the way that seems very natural when somebody is trying to talk about things that happened decades ago, often when they were a child. So while there are some question marks around the exact details of this, the idea of Jovita Idar having a standoff with the Texas Rangers is, in my opinion, absolutely believable. We've already talked about her crossing the border into an active war zone in the company of somebody who was pretending to hold a gun on the driver. Aside from that, though, the Texas Rangers had a long-established and well-documented history of violence and harassment against non-white people and their communities. This included killing at least 5,000 Hispanics between 1914 and 1919. One of these incidents was the Porvenir Massacre on January 28, 1918, when Texas Rangers shot and killed 15 people at a ranch that belonged to Manuel Morales.
These killings and other reports of abuses led to the Joint Committee of the Senate and the House in the investigation of the Texas State Ranger Force, also called the Canales Investigation, in 1919. This was named for J.T. Canales, the only Mexican-American serving in the Texas legislature at the time, who had been critical of the Texas Rangers' conduct and had introduced legislation related to it. The committee that investigated these allegations of misconduct found evidence of, quote, gross violations of civil and criminal statutes, but did not implicate specific rangers or recommend that the force be disbanded.
This standoff against members of the Texas Rangers is one of the things that Jovita Idar is probably the most known for today. It's mentioned in most biographical sketches of her, and it's what is depicted in the 2020 Google Doodle honoring her. But of course, her life continued after these events. In 1916, she founded her own newspaper, Evolucion. A year later, she married plumber and tinsmith Bartolo Juarez. Their wedding was described as a quiet one, with only immediate family members there. They didn't have children together, but Jovita was a big part of raising her sister Elvira's children after Elvira's death in 1925.
By that point, the Mexican Revolution had ended. A new constitution was passed in 1917, although there was one more coup in 1920. Jovita and Bartolo had also moved to San Antonio. In San Antonio, Idar founded a Democratic club and established a free kindergarten. She also served as conference officer for the Women's Society of Christian Service at La Trinidad Methodist Church, and she worked on a Methodist publication called El Heraldo Cristiano.
In the 1920s, the U.S. border with Mexico became progressively less open. As we've talked about, people had basically been able to cross back and forth without really worrying about it for a long time. The U.S. Border Patrol was established in 1924, and while Mexicans were initially exempt from the quotas that were becoming part of immigration law for immigrants from other countries, they were charged a head tax and visa fees. In 1929, the U.S. also started requiring visas for Mexicans to enter the United States, which had not been the case before. During these years, Idar worked with Mexican immigrants to help them obtain the necessary documentation, including naturalization papers for people who wanted to become U.S. citizens.
Jovita Idar eventually developed diabetes, and she contracted tuberculosis, possibly through her work as a medical interpreter for hospital patients. She died in San Antonio, Texas on June 15, 1946, at the age of 60.
In addition to being honored with a Google Doodle, and covered in the New York Times Overlooked series. Laredo's Jovita Idar's El Progreso Park was renamed for her in 2020. She was also included in the American Women Quarters series in 2023. Other quarters in this series have included the subjects of several prior episodes of our show, including Nina Otero Warren, Bessie Coleman, Maria Tallchief, and Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. Quarters that are forthcoming in 2025 include other people we've talked about, including Ida B. Wells and Juliette Gordon-Low. The Jovita Idar quarter features a depiction of her with her blouse made of words. Some of them are the language that's usually on a U.S. quarter, like United States of America and E pluribus unum. But there are also words making up her blouse that include things like Estrella, nurse, La Cruz Blanca, La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, and Mexican-American rights. That is Jovita Idar. I think I actually stumbled across her name for the first time looking at that list of women quarters because it came up for some reason relatively recently.
Do you have listener mail?
I do have listener mail. We've gotten a number of great emails from people about Mammoth Cave and the Kentucky Cave Wars. So we're going to read one of those today that is from Kim. Kim wrote, "Hello, Holly and Tracy. I just finished your episode on the Kentucky Cave Wars and was so excited to share some of my personal experiences of Mammoth Cave with you. I grew up in Barron County, Kentucky, which is right next door to Mammoth Cave. Because of that, it was a yearly occurrence to take a school field trip to the cave. I'm pretty sure we went every year from first grade up through senior year. We also took countless trips there as a family, both to visit the cave and to hike in the surrounding park, which is beautiful. Every time we had family or friends visit, we would go to the park, tour the cave, and picnic in one of the picnic areas. To this day, I know most of the older cave tours by heart, especially the historic and frozen Niagara tours, and I can recite all the fun facts told by the guides right along with them. In pretty much every tour, there's a time where they turn off the lights and you can experience the pure, total darkness. It really is something completely strange. You can sit there for hours and never see anything because of the total lack of light. It is both beautiful and terrifying. It is true that there are still many signs on your way to the park that try to mislead/waylay unknowing tourists into taking the, quote, shortest route to Mammoth Cave, which is not at all the shortest route, so that you drive by their cave/rock shop/gift shop. Locals know to avoid these routes, but love to laugh at the unwitting out-of-town folks who do not. And all of the non-Mammoth show caves will claim to be the most beautiful, most wonderful, or world's best. Many of them are nice to visit as well, but nothing beats the original Mammoth Cave in terms of diversity of formations and history. The TB Hospital was always a favorite area of the cave, as it is the location where they still, I think, hold church services a few times a year, with a naturally elevated place for the pulpit and great acoustics. As a child, my neighbor, an elementary school principal, was one of the most senior cave guides in the park. He worked on summers and school breaks, and it was always fun to see your principal lead your cave tour. He was one of only 2 people to know the final resting place of one of the indigenous mummies that was found in the early days of the cave, displayed in the visitor center for years, and then finally returned to the cave once society realized that was not an okay thing to do. Supposedly, he and another guide took the mummy back into the cave and placed it in a hidden location where it would not be disturbed, and only those 2 knew where it was. He passed away about a decade ago, and I never knew who the other person was, so I have no idea if anyone knows the location of the mummy today, although I imagine the national park would have some sort of records. He once took me and my college friends on a tour as his special guests when they came to visit, even though all the tickets were sold out. I still remember him patting his breast pocket and telling the ticket taker at the cave entrance, "I've got the tickets for these ladies right here in my pocket," as we went into the cave. This, of course, gave me some great street cred with my college friends. You can still take a hike up to the entrance of Sand Cave and see some memorial plaques and signs that tell the story of Floyd Collins. It was one of my favorite hikes to do as a kid because the sandy mouth of the cave was a great place to have a picnic. I was also really interested in the story of Floyd and the terror of getting stuck in the cave. It was and still is hard to reconcile the idea of this beautiful location being the site of such an awful thing. Anyway, I have so many stories of Mammoth Cave, both the cave and the park, but I'll just leave you with some pictures of my furry babies. First, my sweet boy, Malcolm, the flame point. We lost him about a year ago to lymphoma, but he was and is my heart kitty. But never fear, Last November, we adopted 2 new fur babies. The beautiful Tortie and her total tortitude is Jupiter, who had fallen in love with my husband and loves to play fetch with her Mylar balls. The gray and white kitten in Calypso, who is a total toddler in kitten form and is into everything and makes me wonder why we keep on bringing these tiny furry terrors into our house. Spoiler, because they are cute and sweet too. Thank you for the excellent podcast. You keep me company at work and on my commute and are one of the few podcasts I can listen to with my kids in the car. I always learn something new and come away with new things to think about. Kim, thank you so much for this email. Like I said, we've gotten a bunch of emails about Mammoth Cave and other caves in the area, and they've all been great. We'll probably read some others of them. Man, what incredibly cute kitty cats. This little Tortie definitely has the face of like, I am inquisitive and smart, and you better be careful what you try to keep me from doing, because I'll figure it out. And then we have a little kitty with a little gray and white face with a white stripe down to a pink nose, and then kind of making like a little white mustache, lying with feet up, like on the back with feet up, like I don't know. I don't even know what. It's super cute.
Tummy time.
Yeah. Also a cute white kitty, only halfway in the box. The box does not quite fit. Trying to sit anyway. So thank you so much for this. I am kind of curious about the story of the mummy. We did talk in the episode about how the National Park Service has tried to work with indigenous communities to like lay people to rest in a respectful place that is not accessible. So it's not clear whether this was part of that effort or not, but it is still an interesting story to know that that was, something that was kept that secret to keep people from stumbling in quotation marks back across it. So thank you for this email. If you would like to send us a note, we're at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. And we're on social media at Missing History, which is where you can find us on places like the thing that used to be called Twitter. You can subscribe to our show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever else you like to get your podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.